In the 21st century, the remembrance of Ali Shariati has somewhat become forgotten in the recollection of the 1979 Iranian Revolution, such that the role of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini overshadowed Shariati's ideological influence amongst the Iranian students in the middle classes. For such a long time, it was believed that Shariati became a martyr as a result of being assassinated by the Saffari in 1977. Ordered by Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. However, it has now become clear that Shariati in fact did die of a heart attack in Southampton, but his supporters believe this fact is a fabrication of the West and the Iranian elite. In retrospect of the Iranian Revolution and the rumours surrounding Shariati's death, the role of Shariati's martyrdom and the influence of his teachings on martyrdom were significant in understanding the political, religious, and cultural attachments of his supporters, which had inspired them to revolt. Now that we are aware of the truth of Shariati's death, it would be interesting to uncover whether Shariati should be remembered as a martyr and a key revolutionary figure of the Iranian Revolution. The principal focus of this podcast will be to discuss whether Ali Shariati should be remembered as a martyr and an important historical figure of the Iranian Revolution.
Our first guest on this episode will be Ali Rahnema, an Iranian economist and historian who is currently a professor of economics and teaches Middle East and Islamic studies at the American University of Paris. He also wrote one of the only full biographies of Ali Shariati called An Islamic Utopian. Hi, Ali Rahnema.
Thank you for speaking with me.
So do tell me, do you perceive Ali Shariati as a martyr?
I do believe very strongly that Ali Shariati is a martyr, yes. Shariati's own understanding of the notion of martyrdom in his youth strongly influenced the way he presented himself and the way he was perceived both in and after his life. While lecturing at the Hosseini Ershad Institute in Tehran in the early 1970s, Shariati labelled himself as a martyr and argued that those who constantly seek what he described as justice and equality of classes and races fall alongside him in this category. He consistently emphasised the virtue of selflessness when mobilising support, and the almost philosophical manner he delivered his understanding of martyrdom in reflected this deep understanding. In April 1972, he exclaimed to his Ershad students, "Die so others may live," and this echoes the concept he himself subscribed to of individual sacrifice for the greater good. When he died suddenly in 1977, there was significant suspicion of foul play by the Shah and his secret Saffari forces, although we now know he died of natural causes in Southampton. However, his presumed assassination placed him alongside revolutionary individuals he had labelled martyrs, who died at the hands of the Shah's regime. In this traditional sense of the concept of a martyr, someone killed for their beliefs, Ali Shariati very clearly fits this mould. However, I believe attention must be paid to Shariati's perception of his own role, visualising his part as having broader, more long-term consequences for the revolution. Shariati defended his role lecturing and spreading ideas as fostering a sort of cultural revolution. By fueling a revolutionary vanguard with his ideas, the population would later hopefully flock to their side, and this unification of groups against the regime would be crucial in ensuring a successful revolution. Even before his death, Shariati represented a myth, a sort of symbol of liberation and freedom of oppression beyond the power I believe an individual holds by themselves. I believe Shariati served as a figure of a martyr even when he was alive, his death only extending the reach and increasing the popularity of his teachings.
In that case, what is your interpretation of martyrdom?
I believe a martyr is an influential individual whose death escalates the importance of a cause. While I understand with knowledge of his natural death since, Shariati no longer fits the traditional definition of a martyr killed for their beliefs, but the perception at the time that he did pose a threat to the oppressive regime and was killed because of it was enough to earn his ideas popular support. And therefore, in my opinion, Ali Shariati very clearly earns the title of a martyr.
So how did Shariati's concept of martyrdom influence the attitudes of the participants in the revolution?
Shariati definitely achieved the largest influence over the young adult generation of students who attended his lectures, read his works, and adopted his ideas wholeheartedly, leading to him achieving an almost cult-like status. In the early 70s, Shariati moved from teaching at the University of Mashhad to lecturing at Ershad in Tehran. Ershad attracted a younger, more liberal Islamic audience beyond the traditional mosque-goers, an audience that Shariati's teaching would appeal to most. Shariati voiced concerns that if he spoke out too virulently, he risked the closure of Ershad, yet he was summoned by Saffari on a series of occasions when the regime was concerned he was sharing highly provocative ideological concepts. However, Shariati was the subject of immense frustration throughout 1971 and 72 at his silence over the regime's executions of Mujahideen members. There are several accounts of students either confronting him directly or interrupting his lectures to raise the fiery issues, and a member of the Mujahideen central leadership, Ahmed Rezai, reprimanded Shariati for supposedly distracting the students from the path of armed struggle and actually accused him of fulfilling the interests of the regime. In February 72, Shariati delivered his famous speech named Martyrdom, reaffirming his support for the Mujahideen's cause and glorifying the role of a martyr and the freedom fighters' struggle, arguing only the conscious choice of martyrdom could break the hold the regime had enforced on the people, identifying coercion, money, fear and deception as these factors. Even more provocative was his speech after martyrdom, delivered less than a month later at Narmak Mosque, following a series of these said executions, including 4 of Shariati's ex-students. He referred to the executed men as martyrs and spoke out against what he described as an unjust, repressive and murderous government. By eulogising the armed struggle and blessing the guerrillas as martyrs, he justified their struggle in religious terms. These provocative speeches further alerted Saffari to the spreading of revolutionary ideas, and Ershad was closed down by the Shah's authorities in November of 1972. In private, Shariati was accused of working with the regime and limiting revolutionary activity with his so-called empty words. Yet, I confidently believe he was fully conscious his spreading of ideas was mobilising freedom fighters. Shariati was imprisoned and Ershad closed on the accusation that his increasingly militant lectures had allowed Ershad to become a recruiting ground for the Mujahideen, highlighting the authorities' awareness and concern at the reach of Shariati's inspiring concepts. By the time he died in 1977, Shariati was a household name within Iran. Historian Ervand Abrahamian identified how the fundamental essence of Shi'ism Shariati preached, revolution against all forms of oppression, including capitalism and imperialism, were key catalysts that mobilised the public and popularised Shariati's ideas, fueling this revolution. In his preaching of revolution and martyrdom as all Muslims' duties, Shariati arguably dethroned the clergy as the sole interpreters of Islam, and the popularity of his ideas encouraged a revolutionary battle against the despotism of the Shah's regime.
What is Shariati's legacy today, and is he still perceived as a martyr?
While suspicion has ceased and he is understood to have died from natural causes, Ali Shariati's legacy as the ideologue of the Iranian Revolution and his role as a martyr is still ever relevant today. As an individual, he has been described as a myth by myself and Ansari, to name a few scholars, whose legacy still exerts a powerful influence on contemporary Iranian political thought. If the Republic of Iran were to allow it, I believe Shariati is a figure whom modern Iranian students perhaps ought to consider paying more attention to. The conditions in which Shariati grew up and developed his political thought undeniably shaped his thinking and consequently the influence of his ideas upon others. The intellectual environment that was vital to the development of his thinking criticised the traditional Islamic social and political structures in which he lived. The monarchy was consciously attempting to transition from Iran's presumed traditional status to a Western-defined state of modernity, leading to significant social, economic and political change in Iran, In their revisiting of Ali Shariati's thought and legacy in post-revolutionary Iran, Siavash Saffari argues that neo-Shariatis have contributed to advancing Shariati's ideas on modernity and breaking down the stereotype of Muslim societies being unable to modernize. Shariati's concepts reinterpreted truly traditional Islam, uncorrupted by imperialism, monarchy, and the clerical establishment in a modern setting, explaining why he receives such significant and widespread support. However, the clerical regime that exists today was not what Shariati had envisaged or promised, and therefore the ideas he represents are just as relevant today and attract a similar audience. He is certainly still viewed as a martyr within Iran, but you will scarcely find in-depth knowledge or understanding of his teachings and the greater significance of his role in Western thought. However, this does not undermine his martyr status and his continued importance to Iranians like myself.
Thank you, Ali Rahnema, for sharing your insightful thoughts on the concept of martyrdom.
It was a pleasure.
I will now introduce our second guest, Michel Foucault, who is a French philosopher and historian of ideas whose Shariati was greatly influenced by, specifically his teachings on religion and its relationship with politics. Foucault saw the revolution in Iran as the coming together of religion and the political state, which he believed was important for the survival of religions.
So my question to you would be, what is your opinion of Shariati's concept of martyrdom?
So Shariati's concept of martyrdom is interesting to me as his definition of martyr, whereby the intentional living artist whose religious fervour to fight injustice leads to something greater than themselves, in that their martyrdom affects living art as well as the art of living. I support Shariati's notion of martyrdom because this allows anyone to become a martyr if they have inspired religion in some way, in contrast to the more secular Western concept, which emphasises one dying for a cause they believe in strongly, not necessarily in a religious context. To me, Shariati's concept of martyrdom had a huge impact on ideological and religious thought of many Iranians in the 1970s because of his teachings emphasising the traditional celebration of martyrs, such as the Islamic story of Imam Hussein ibn Ali, the King of Martyrs, and the Battle of Karbala in his work in Arise and Bear Witness. Therefore, his interpretation of these stories to Muslims of the modern day inspired them to break free from the Shah regime and protest as active agents. We have now seen this in the revolution, where revolutionaries such as the Mujahideen, who fought against the Shah's injustice and corrupt regime for a more democratic country. Iran needed a notion of coming back to what Islam was at the time of the Prophet, but also of advancing towards a luminous and distant point where it would be possible to renew fidelity rather than maintain obedience. So, in my opinion, Shariati did this flawlessly in his work on martyrdom and modernising traditional Islam.
Now, in the past, Shariati was believed to be killed by the Saffari and thus was perceived as a martyr, despite his death being of natural causes. Do you think that we can still perceive him as a martyr because of the great influence his death had in the revolution?
Well, obviously, this is a controversial question, but in the West, Shariati cannot be defined as a martyr. However, in my opinion, Shariati did die like a martyr. He was hunted, driven out of his home in Iran, and his books were even banned. By Shariati's definition alone, he was a martyr, as he inspired significant religious action in the revolution and rebirthed a new meaning of Islam that inspired a whole generation to revolt against injustice.
Do you think that Shariati was the most important figure in the revolution?
Yes, definitely. Shariati inspired a religious phenomenon and political spirituality, which was a cause for hope in Iran, as it was what the people of Iran were looking for. Ayatollah Shariat Mahadri even noted that Iran was waiting for the return of the next Imam, which is what Shariati's whole concept of martyrdom centered upon. Shariati, in my opinion, was the thinker who formulated this vision of the people of Iran fighting to gain new social forms based on religious spirituality. He did this by reviving the original inspiration for fighting injustice with his references to the first Imam in his conception of martyrdom. Also, Shariati reinterpreted Islam to cater to the modern world's political systems. This considerably differed to Western models which have been discussed at the time of the revolution and before for the fate of Iran. Also, many in the West feared the spread of Shariati's work to more countries with a majority Muslim population, in fears that it would express anti-Western sentiment, widening the divide between the West and the East. Shariati's works were so influential that his books were even banned in Indonesia because of the large support he gained from the Muslim population.
What was the West's response to the revolution and Shariati's ideas and ideology?
So, the Westerners undoubtedly find Islam in the Middle East and the role it plays in the global sphere of politics as hostile against the West, as Islam not only a religious threat but a political and ideological risk. I would go as far as to argue that the political spirituality of what Shariati and his followers intended for Iran threatened the West just as much as the threat of communism in the 1970s and 80s.
That's an interesting point.
Yeah, in my opinion, this is why the revolution and its ideas was treated and contained in the same way as the communist threat. The fact Shariati was heavily influenced by my own teachings and religion during his time in Paris in years prior to the revolution just goes to show that the Western ideologies of socialist democracy and Marxism did influence Shariati's political thought and thus manifested in the minds of his supporters.
Our last guest on this episode will be an Iranian construction worker who was present in the revolution. So do tell me, how did you learn of Shariati during the revolution?
Thank you for having me on this episode. During the revolution, I was a construction worker and a member of the Iranian Workers' Solidarity Network. It was through the events after the Black Friday massacre which introduced the ideas of Shariati and Ayatollah Khomeini. I had heard of Shariati through the student protests. I had spoken to many students during the revolution who also explained his teachings to me. I had never taken much interest in student movements which led up to the revolution, nor had I heard of Shariati until his death sparked outrage amongst the younger members of society. The student movements did not appeal to me as a worker, as they called for a different kind of regime change. Shariati's ideas, from what I understand of them, appeared decadent and called for a regime of religious philosophy rather than tangible results for the working class. Under the Shah, the scourge of westernization was destroying Iranian culture. The so-called modernization of the White Revolution was simply making us a puppet of the West. We had no independence, sovereignty, nor a national identity, if we were destroying our nation's history like this. While I am not a scholar, I know the teachings of the Quran and Khomeini. For my generation, the Shah was banning our religious freedoms under his secular policies. Many of my friends took part in marches organized by their work unions against the revolution, calling for improved standards of living. Many of these marches appeared socialist and almost Western to me. This is why Khomeini appealed to so many religious traditionalists like myself. He called for our national identity back, to install a clerical regime which could speak for the majority of Iranians and not the few who were educated in philosophy and critical thinking.
Do you still perceive Shariati as a martyr, even though he died of a heart attack?
So, from the events that took place after Shariati's death amongst the student movement, Shariati is no doubt a martyr in our eyes. No matter what the Western claims may be that he died of a heart attack, we don't trust these reports. If we did trust the pro-Western government under the Shah, then why would we trust a source that undermines our republic? Shariati was exiled, an enemy of the Shah. It seems suspicious to us that he mysteriously died one day in England. Even if the reports are correct, he died for the cause of the revolution. The physical burden of his imprisonment, exile away from his family, and as a result being on his own, must have had a serious impact on his health, which therefore aided his death. Shariati, amongst hundreds, died for the revolution and for the regime change.
What does martyrdom mean to you, and what was your experience during the revolution?
Some of my friends have been martyred, some during the revolution, and later joined the army in defense of our nation against Iraq during the Iran-Iraq war. For us to be martyred is the highest honor, both in the eyes of Islam and in the patriotic duty to one's country. For my martyred friends' families, this was also a means of great social mobility. Many of the families are treated with the utmost respect in our community, and every year we celebrate the family member they had lost in the revolution or during the war on Islamic Republic Day. Everyone in our country knows who they are, even outside of our community and in other cities, and those who they lost in the revolution or in the war. Martyrdom is not a tragedy here, unlike how it's viewed in the West. It is a great honour to have known those martyrs. Anyone could be martyred here, as long as they devote themselves to our nation and to Islam. You do not need to be a soldier, general, or cleric. You can come from humble beginnings and be remembered forever in your nation. My experience during the 1979 revolution was an exciting one. At the time, I was working on the building project in Reza Shah Avenue in Tehran. Large crowds started to form, calling for the end of the Shah and the return of Khomeini from exile. Myself and others threw down our tools and stopped the work. We occupied many of the building projects which were ordered by the Shah and hung banners and slogans from the buildings which were once constructed in his name. It was very exciting, but I also remember feelings of anger against the Shah, especially following the events which took place earlier after the Black Friday massacre. Myself and others had pride in the national movement which crossed all classes of Iranians in the call for a republic and independence from a pro-Western Shah. During the revolution, we were ready to start our own national identity, one of which we had forged after the events of the revolution and the Iran-Iraq war. Yet today, some of us are not sure if we truly did achieve the freedoms we once called for, and often wonder what would have happened if Shari'ati had not died, and the consequences that would have had on the revolution and our concept of martyrdom.
Considering all the interesting viewpoints from Western and Iranian observers and the participants of the revolution, it is valid to say that Shariati's influence was somewhat reduced to his ideological role, as he could not appeal to the working classes. The misbelief of Shariati's martyrdom infuriated protesters and acted as another key motivation for the Iranians to despise the Shah's monarchy even more. Arguably, had Shariati been alive during the revolution, it is possible that Shariati could have become the figurehead of the revolution instead of Khomeini. So, listeners, what do you think? Should Shariati be remembered as a martyr and an important historical figure of the 1979 Iranian Revolution?